All right, everyone, get ready, because today we're going deep on some pretty intense financial stuff. You ever get that feeling like you find out something that just makes you rethink everything? Well, that is exactly what happened to the author of The Retirement Miracle when he found out some really crazy information about the U.S. national debt. It's the kind of thing that makes you worry if your retirement plans are built on solid ground. But don't worry, we'll explain everything so you'll leave feeling confident and informed, I promise.
Yeah, it's true that it can be overwhelming trying to figure out all this financial stuff and all the conflicting information out there. But that's exactly why we're here, to sort through the complexity and make sure you have what you need to make good decisions about your future.
Exactly. So let's start with that moment in The Retirement Miracle where the author realizes all this. He describes it in a way we can all relate to. He's just eating breakfast, reading USA Today, and he finds an article that practically makes him choke on his oatmeal.
Oh, wow. I got to hear this. What was so shocking in this article?
So the article is about the national deficit, and it shows this unbelievable difference in how the government reports this number. Back in 2007, they said the deficit was $162 billion.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that number alone would be concerning. But it gets worse.
Oh, yeah, it gets a lot worse.
Yeah.
The article said that the real deficit, the one that includes all the government's long-term stuff like Social Security and Medicare, it was actually $2.5 trillion. That's like finding out your credit card bill is 15 times higher than you thought.
Oh, wow. No wonder the author choked. We're talking about a difference of trillions of dollars. It really shows how the way we measure and talk about financial information can totally change how we see a problem.
For sure. And what really bothered the author is that nobody was really talking about this true national debt. It's like this giant elephant in the room that everyone is ignoring.
It really is like finding out your family has a secret pile of debt hidden somewhere. Makes you wonder, what else aren't they telling me? And how is this going to affect my future?
Exactly. And that's where liabilities come in. See, companies have to list all their liabilities on their balance sheets, even future expenses they've already agreed to. But the government, they don't follow those same rules.
That's like saying you don't have to count how much you owe on your mortgage until you actually make a payment. Even though you legally have to pay it off over like 30 years, that wouldn't give a very accurate picture of your finances, would it?
Absolutely not. And because the government uses this different way of accounting, the real national debt in 2011 was a crazy $76.1 trillion. That's over 5 times bigger than the official number.
Wow. To put that into perspective, that's like over $250,000 for every person in America, or over $1 million for every taxpayer. It's kind of hard to even imagine a number that big.
I know, right? It's like trying to picture all the grains of sand on a beach. The author actually uses this great analogy in the book to show just how huge a trillion really is. He talks about how his son explained to him that a trillion seconds ago was 30,000 BC.
Wow, that really puts things into perspective. So if you spend $1 trillion, you'd have to spend about $31.5 million every single year, basically since the beginning of civilization.
That's crazy. And this brings us to the next point, what could happen because of this massive hidden debt. It's not just some random number, it's a real burden that will probably affect us all in the future.
Exactly. And it's not only people who will be retiring in the future who need to worry. The author of The Retirement Miracle was already really concerned about how this would impact people planning for retirement back in 2011.
And that's when David Walker becomes important, right?
Exactly. David Walker was the former Comptroller General of the United States, basically the country's top accountant. And he was really trying to warn everyone about this.
The book mentions that Walker went on a media tour to raise awareness about how dangerous it was to ignore this huge debt. What was he saying?
Well, some of the things he said were pretty serious. Like he said, if our country were a company, we would be out of business. He also compared the situation to having fiscal cancer, which really emphasizes how bad the problem is.
Wow, he's not holding back. He also said our very way of life is at risk. Do you think that's exaggerating, or is it really that bad?
It's definitely a strong statement, but I think it shows how worried he was about the country's long-term financial stability. Whether people actually listen to him or not is another question.
Right, and this is where politics and the media come in, right? How much of this is the public actually hearing, and are we getting the full picture?
That's a really good question. It makes you wonder how much attention these warnings got back then, and whether the media coverage was enough. But let's switch gears a little and talk about how this ties into retirement planning, which is the main focus of The Retirement Miracle.
Yes, that's what I'm really curious about. The author was looking into retirement planning when he found out about the national debt. So how did this change his view on how people should get ready for retirement?
Well, one of the biggest concerns the book brings up is whether Social Security will even last. See, Social Security works by taking money from people who are working now and using that money to pay benefits to people who are already retired.
Okay, that makes sense. But I've heard people compare Social Security to a Ponzi scheme. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, the author talks about that in the book. He mentions this workshop where someone yelled out, "It's just a Ponzi scheme."
Mm.
And while it's not technically a Ponzi scheme in the traditional sense, there are some interesting similarities.
Oh, okay. So what are the main differences?
A Ponzi scheme is designed to trick investors by paying the early investors using money from newer investors, and it eventually collapses when there aren't enough new investors to keep it going.
Okay, so how is Social Security different?
Well, Social Security is run by the government, and it's meant to provide some security for people in retirement. It's not designed to make a few people rich at the expense of everyone else. But the problem is that the system needs a constant flow of money from workers to be able to pay the people who are retired.
And what happens if that flow of money slows down?
Well, that's when it starts to look more like a Ponzi scheme. The author talks about how the ratio of workers to retirees has been going down like crazy. In 1945, there were 42 workers for every one retiree. Now it's closer to 3 workers for every retiree. And it's predicted to be only 2 workers for every retiree in the next few decades.
So there are less people working to support a growing number of retirees. That doesn't seem sustainable.
Exactly. And this is where those government accounting practices we were talking about come back. To cover its other expenses, the government borrows money from the Social Security Trust Fund, which is basically like writing itself an IOU.
Oh, so it's not like there's an actual vault of money labeled Social Security that's running out.
No, it's more like the government is just building up a bigger and bigger IOU to the Social Security program.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects. The government has this huge debt, partly because it borrows from Social Security, and this could eventually threaten the whole system. But what does this mean for the average person who's just trying to plan for their retirement?
Well, one of the biggest things to worry about is that taxes might go up in the future. If the national debt keeps growing so fast, the government will probably have to raise taxes to pay its bills.
That's a scary thought. The book even mentions how the highest tax rate in the U.S. was over 90% back in the 1940s. Could we go back to that?
It's hard to know for sure what will happen, but it's definitely something to think about. And this leads us to the main point of what the author calls the retirement miracle. He's suggesting a way that could potentially protect your retirement savings from these possible tax increases.
Okay, now you've got my attention. How is that even possible? Tell me more about this retirement miracle strategy.
Well, that's a conversation for part 2 of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
Okay, so we've talked about how the national debt situation is, well, let's just say it's not great. And we mentioned this retirement miracle strategy that could maybe help us deal with all this financial mess. So tell me, what is this secret weapon the author is talking about?
All right, let's get into it. The author calls it the retirement miracle. And it's all about using a specific financial product that lets you access your retirement money tax-free no matter how old you are when you retire.
Wait, tax-free? I know there's no such thing as a free lunch. So how does this work? Is there some kind of loophole we're using here?
Not exactly a loophole,
Mm-hmm.
but it definitely challenges how we usually think about retirement planning. It's all based on the idea of using life insurance in the right way. Now, before you think life insurance, that's for old people, just hear me out. We're not talking about your typical life insurance policy.
Okay, I'm listening. Convince me why life insurance isn't just for, people getting ready to,
Don't never. The kind of life insurance the author talks about is designed to be a powerful savings tool. You put money into the policy, and it grows without being taxed. Kind of like a 401k or IRA.
Okay, sounds good so far. But how does this help you avoid taxes when you retire? I mean, you eventually have to use that money, right?
Right, but here's the interesting part. Instead of taking withdrawals from your retirement account like usual, which would get taxed as income, you get the money through what are called policy loans.
Policy loans. Okay, I'm going to need you to explain that. I'm not exactly a financial expert.
Sure. Think of it like this. You're basically borrowing money from yourself, using the cash value of your life insurance as collateral. And the important thing is that these loans aren't taxed as income.
Wait, so you're saying you can borrow against your life insurance policy and not pay taxes on that money? How is that even legal?
It's totally legal. It's something smart investors have been doing for years. As long as the policy is set up correctly, you can keep taking out loans until the death benefit is used up.
Wow, so you're basically skipping the whole taxable retirement withdrawal system. This sounds almost too good to be true.
It can be a really powerful strategy, but it's important to remember that it's not some magic solution. There are some complicated things and potential downsides to consider. That's why the book really stresses how important it is to work with a good financial professional, someone who understands all the details of these types of policies.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if this is something you could just do yourself. It sounds like you need a real expert to help you with this.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that these policies aren't right for everyone. They usually require higher payments than regular life insurance. And they might not be the best fit for people who don't have a lot of money to invest.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but it could be really useful for some people who want to protect their retirement savings from those big tax increases we were talking about.
Exactly. And that's really the main message the author wants people to understand. With this huge national debt and all the uncertainty about taxes in the future, it's really important to at least look into different ways to plan for retirement.
I gotta say, I was a little skeptical at first, but this whole idea of using life insurance as a way to save is actually really interesting. It's making me completely rethink how I've always thought about retirement planning.
I think that's a natural reaction. It goes against everything we've been told about how to prepare for retirement, but sometimes you have to think outside the box, especially when the rules of the game are changing.
So for our listeners who are now really interested in this strategy, what should they do next? Where do they go from here?
The author really emphasizes getting advice from a qualified financial professional, someone who specializes in these types of life insurance policies. They can help you figure out if this strategy fits your financial goals and how much risk you're comfortable with.
Makes sense. You don't want to jump into something like this without doing your research and making sure it's right for you.
Exactly. And I think this brings us back to that question we asked earlier. If we're not really talking about the true national debt, what other important financial facts might be hidden from us?
Yeah, that's where things start to get a little scary for me. It feels like we're just scratching the surface here. And who knows what else is out there.
It's kind of realizing the map you've been using to plan your financial life is missing some parts. It makes you question everything.
So what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What can they do to feel more in control and less like they're at the mercy of these hidden financial things?
I think the first step is awareness, which you're already showing by listening to this conversation. We've gone over a lot of complicated information, and it's a lot to take in. But just being aware of these issues is a huge step in the right direction.
Knowledge is power. I love that. It's easy to feel stuck when you hear all this bad financial news. But you're right. Understanding what's going on is the first step to taking charge.
Exactly. And it's not just about listening to information. It's about being proactive, asking questions, and looking for different points of view. Don't just accept the usual advice without thinking. Question it, explore other options, and find what works for you.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's easy to think there's only one right way to plan for retirement, but there's so many different ways to do it.
Right. And that's why it's so important to find a financial advisor who really gets what you want and is willing to think outside the box. Not all advisors are the same. So you need to do your research and find someone who shares your values.
Definitely. It's kind of like finding a good doctor. You want someone you can trust and who's looking out for you.
Exactly. And remember, planning your finances is a lifelong thing. It's not something you do once and then forget about. Your needs and goals will change as you get older. So it's important to look at your plan regularly and make changes when you need to.
This whole conversation has been a real eye-opener for me. It's made me realize I need to be more proactive about planning my own retirement and not just assume that everything will be fine. I'm definitely going to read The Retirement Miracle and do some more research on this life insurance strategy. It's a totally new way to think about saving for retirement that I never even thought of before.
That's great. And remember, even if this particular strategy isn't the right fit for you, the most important thing is to keep learning and looking at different options. There's no one perfect answer when it comes to financial planning. So the key is finding what works best for you.
I totally agree. So to wrap up our deep dive today, the national debt is a much bigger problem than most people realize. And it could really affect our future, especially when it comes to planning for retirement.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there are things we can do to reduce those risks and make our financial future more secure. It starts with awareness, education, and being willing to challenge the way things are usually done. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions. Get advice from experts and explore new strategies.
Well said. And with that, a big thank you to our expert for walking us through this deep dive. It's been informative, thought-provoking, and honestly, a little bit scary at times.
It was my pleasure. I think it's really important to talk about these things and bring these complicated financial issues to light. The more we know as individuals, the better prepared we'll be to deal with whatever challenges come our way.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep the conversation going. Read The Retirement Miracle, or do your own research on this important issue. The more you know, the better prepared you'll be to handle any financial problems that might come up. Until next time, happy diving.